Hello, today we are talking about the domain and range from a graph. We are given this graph that starts here at A and ends at D. This D has an open circle and the A has a closed circle. The others are also closed circle. We want to determine the domain and range from a graph. The domain is the set of all x values, and the range is the set of all y values. It may be helpful to actually name some of these points. So let's first go through and name these points. So this ordered pair here that's A is going to be -8, -2. This ordered pair is 1, 6. And this ordered pair is 7, -1. We don't really need B because it's in the middle. It's not the highest point. It's not the lowest. It's not the furthest left or the furthest right. So we don't really need that when we're determining the domain and range. Now, the domain is the set of x values from left to right represented on the graph. So if we're looking at the leftmost point in this problem, in this graph, is A, which happens to be -8 and -2. And since domain are the x values, then our leftmost x value is -8. So that's where this graphic is going to start. Also, since this is a closed circle, we are going to represent this -8 with a bracket for interval notation. And it's a bracket instead of parentheses because the bracket represents a closed circle, and it means that -8 is included in that interval. If we continue with this graph starting on the left, how far right does it go? It goes to here. This point is 7, -1. Domain means just the x value. So the x value of this point is 7. So we're going to include that as the end point. So we have the beginning at -8 and it goes to 7 as your rightmost x value. Now we need to determine in the interval notation, do we need a bracket or a parentheses? We would need a bracket if this was a closed circle, but since this is an open circle, we need parentheses. So our domain for this graph is bracket -8 to 7 parentheses. So we're including -8 and not including 7. Now let's look at the range. The range is the bottommost y value to the topmost y value, or the smallest y value to the largest y value on the graph. Our lowest or smallest y value, if we were to look at this and go down the graph like this, the lowest point we hit is actually this A value. It's actually the A value. So even though these both are kind of low, the A value is lower. It also has a smaller y value here than this point. So our starting y value for the range is -2. And since this is a closed circle, it will get a bracket. And now, again, we're going from the bottom to the top. So our lowest up to the highest y value. So the highest y value is here with C. Its y value is 6. So it's going to go from -2 to 6. And since C is a closed circle, this will get a bracket. So the range there is -2 included to 6 included. Bracket here, bracket there. So this is one example. Let's do another one. So we want to determine the domain and range of this graph. So domain, again, is the set of x values, the set of x values from left to right. So this point is -1, 2, and this point is 7, 2. So our domain is going to be left to right. So the leftmost x value here is -1. It's a closed circle, so the -1 will have a bracket with it. And if I go all the way, the rightmost value is 7, And it's also a closed circle, so it will have a bracket. So leftmost x to rightmost x. Now let's look at range. Our range is from the lowest y value to the highest. Now we don't have a notation here for the highest point. We only have 2 points actually plotted on this graph or notated on this graph. But there is a highest point here with this graph, and it is this point right here. So let's label that point. That point is 3, 6. So if we're thinking about range being the lowest y value to the highest, our lowest y value here is 2. And it's okay if this is 2 and this is 2. It's just saying that 2 is our lowest even if it shows up twice. Even if it shows up twice. 2 is the lowest y value in this graph. So we're going to start with 2. And since both of these are closed, it will be a bracket there. And then our highest y value is actually this point up here, and that y value is 6. And since that is a closed circle, it will be a bracket. Now, often I'm asked, well, it didn't show that there was a dot there that was filled in, and you just have to remember that if there is no open circle here on this graph, each of those points represented on the line are actually closed in circles. So they're actually going to be points. They're not, they're included. They're not included. So they're actually points on the line. I could go through and make a dot for every one of these. There would be infinitely many. But you just need to remember, if there's not a dot represented, then it is a closed circle. Okay? Let's look at another one. This one's a little different. Okay, let's see if we can move it down a little bit. All right, so on this one, this one's different, right? So I don't have a start and an end. It just kind of goes off to the right. But we can label the point we know. So this point here is going to be 1, -3. Now, our domain, let's just think about what we have been talking about. Domain is left to right x values. So our leftmost x value comes up here, and it is the x value 1. So we're pulling this 1 out of this graph. And this is a closed circle, so that will be a bracket. But how far right does this go? So if I keep going, if this just goes off the graph and there's no point there, there's no point notated, closed in, it doesn't stop, you need to assume that this keeps going. So we're going to assume this keeps going, and a little bit more to the right every single time, a little bit more to the right every single time. So eventually, as this gets lower, it's going to keep going to the right. So if it doesn't stop, it keeps going and going and going, remember that that is infinity. We should also remember that infinity doesn't have a certain number that we can define, so we have to use a parentheses there for the interval notation for infinity. Now let's look at range. Range is from the bottom to the top. So what is the lowest y value up to the highest y value? So our lowest y value, again, this is going off the graph, and it's not defined. So this is going down, 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 down forever. So if this is going down forever, it will be infinity is where it's going to, you could say, start. So it starts all the way down at infinity, but since it's going down, think about where are these numbers going. This is negative, so it's going in the negative direction. So this is actually going to be negative infinity. And just like we did before, if it's infinity, we need parentheses because we can't say a certain number is included in this interval. All right, now if we go up, what is the highest y value here? So we stop at this point and that y value is -3. So we're going to include that here. And since this is a closed circle, that will be a bracket. So that's another type of graph. I have two more I want to show you. There's all different ways that graphs can be represented. So I want to make sure you see some variety here. Let's look at this one. So this one is going off the graph to the left. So let's find the domain and range here. Our domain, again, is left to right. Let's define this point. So this is 2, 2. And then we need to think, how far left does it go? Well, you have to assume, again, that if there's nothing here, it just goes off the graph, it touches the end of the graph, that it is going to keep going there. It's going to go, 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 the further you go. So it's going further and further left. Again, that's infinity. But if it's going to the left, that's going in the negative direction here. So that's going to be negative infinity. And we have parentheses because it is infinity. All right, now how far right does it go? So if I come down here, it's going to the right, going to the right, going to the right. What is that point? So that point is 2 for the x value. So we're pulling x values for domain, y values for range. Again, this is a closed circle, so we're going to put a bracket. Now let's do range. Lowest y value to highest. So lowest value on this is going to be the y value of 2. And since this is a closed circle, we'll do a bracket. And how high does it go? So I went from the lowest, how far up does it go? We have to assume that it goes on and on and on forever. So this will also go to infinity. And this is going to be a parentheses there. It's not negative because we're going up. So it's going in the positive infinity direction. So that's the range for this graph. Let's show one more. Let's see if I can't even get this on the screen. There we go. All right, this is actually just a standard parabola. And it's been shifted some, but let's define a couple points. Now notice that we don't have any points like labeled on this graph, but we can figure out some of these points. And the biggest point that we need to know with parabolas is the vertex. And the vertex is either the lowest point or the highest, depending on the way the parabola is shaped. In this one, we have a parabola that's turning up. So we have a minimum point here. And we need to label this point. So this is going to be 2, -4. And now let's find the domain and range. So our domain is left to right, left to right. How far left, how far right, x values. So how far left does this go? Well, again, it goes off the graph, so we assume that it goes on and on and on and on forever. So that will be infinity. But if it goes to the left, it's negative. And because it's infinity, you get a parentheses there. And then we're going to the right. So we're coming down, and how far right does it go? So it's going back up, but it is going further and further and further right. So that's, again, going to be infinity there. And parentheses because it is infinity. So a parabola literally encompasses every x value on its domain. So it will go, you can find a point for any number that you pick for the x value. Let's talk about range. So range here is lowest y value to highest. Lowest to highest. So how far down does this go? It goes to this point. And what is the y value of that point? That is -4. It's a closed circle here. Okay, remember, if there's no open circle, it's assumed to be closed. So that's going to be a bracket. And then how far up does it go? So we have this going in 2 directions up, but no matter which side you look at, they're both going up, 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 up forever. So that is going to be infinity, and infinity always gets parentheses. So I know I spent quite some time talking about the domain and range from a graph. There are so many different kinds, and there's still many that I didn't get to talk about today, but I hope this helps you a little bit on defining the domain and range when given a graph.